Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 52 in the podcast series. I am calling this one Learning Through Failure, and it was inspired by this sweet little sweater modification behind me that I'll talk about in the episode today. I also have Spencer coming on to talk about some things. I have a new book for you in the rare and hard to find knitting and spinning book series, and the next sweater. I've got a new designer to share with you, so this should all be pretty fun. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. This is a podcast that's largely about knitting, a little bit of spinning, and lots of garment design and modification. So if you like those things, you're in the right place. And if you're coming back to the podcast, welcome back. It's lovely to see you. I am coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, where it is a very blustery day. We had a beautiful 50-degree day yesterday, and then the front came through, and now it's 30 and really windy out there. So I'm hoping that won't mess with the sound too much. The light is also going to be a little bit like whoosh as those clouds get pushed into the sun and out of the sun. So it's going to be one of those days. But it is a beautiful Sunday morning here, and I hope you all are well, and I can't wait to talk to you about all this good, fun stuff. So we're going to jump right in with a segment with Spencer, and then we'll come back and talk about this sweater. So Spencer is on this segment of the podcast, and we're here to talk about redoing things and learning from failure. And I have to say what Spencer said earlier.
We just redid this section of the podcast 3 times. We had dogs in our laps and
the light was weird.
And anyway, third time's a charm.
We're here. The dogs are occupied. We've got we don't know how
short
long.
amount of time.
Yeah. But anyway, I am going to talk about another sweater that I've been working on and modifying in the next segment, and I messed it up, and Spencer was the one who noticed it.
It wasn't that bad. It was done. She was all proud. And I think I said something like, the thing I love about it is the way the neck's totally off to one side, or something like that.
And it was late at night, and I was kind of delusional, and I was just oh no, you're totally right.
I should have waited till the morning.
No, it was better that you just said something. So we got to thinking about, redoing things and failure and how failure actually teaches us a lot. I know from that sweater, I learned a million things that I never would have learned if I were just following a perfect pattern and everything just came out right.
She redid it 3 or 4 different ways at different times.
And it was just cool to think about the process of how does this work and what's going to fix it. So we got to thinking about failure and redoing things.
Yeah.
And you redo things a lot too.
Yeah. I feel like when I'm doing a project, it's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
You always come in the house saying that.
But almost always the redoing makes it better.
Yeah.
Not always, sometimes you just thrash material so much that it's just, it's worse or something.
Yeah, and that does happen with yarn. If you knit with something and reknit with it and reknit with it, at some point the yarn just loses its twist and elasticity and everything else, and it needs to be washed and redone, and sometimes that'll bring it back.
I'm also thinking about that front door of ours.
Oh God.
We have this really nice looking front door that just doesn't close. And I've been redoing it for years, trying to get it dialed in, and at this point it's we just need a whole new house.
Yeah, a new house. That's what we need. Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking about you.
Okay.
And when you decide to redo something.
Yeah.
And there's this term in construction work, I don't know if everyone uses this, but it's allowable tolerances. So the basic idea there is that different jobs have different allowances for variation. Being screwed up. Yeah. So if you're putting down concrete for a nice basketball court, you want it to be just the perfect mix,
smooth, flat,
everything,
level, everything.
But if you're throwing concrete in a fence post hole, it's you got too much water or whatever. It's not a big deal. So you have a higher allowable tolerance on some jobs than others, and that's based on the materials, the audience, if it has aesthetic purposes, all that kind of stuff.
And if you're building a porch or a deck or something where it needs to hold weight or all that kind of stuff.
A lot of times it's practical. Sort of your sweater needs to be warm or fit your body or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever. So that's a very
it's a pretty broad category.
I was going to say it's a very objective way of thinking about redoing. You just look at the allowable tolerances and you decide this needs to be redone or this doesn't need to be redone. But sometimes, I know with you and also with me, it just something just gets stuck in your craw and you've got to fix it, even though it doesn't really matter to...
Yeah, my sweater worked. It had 2 arms, it had a front. I bet no one else would have known. I'm the maker. I didn't even notice it until Spencer pointed it out. So it's like,
But
or
you
like that
really-
cable that I messed up on your sweater.
But
Like,
you wanted it to be right.
but you think to yourself,
Yeah.
I want this to be right.
Okay, but if you're, like on this last staircase I was building,
Yeah.
some of that stuff was so buried under finish work that if there was a 1/4 inch gap on some of the framing,
It didn't matter.
but I did want it to be right. You know, it's like, oh, I really want it to be right.
Now
But
you're going to tell me something. Sometimes he tells me things like later, like after everything's done and we've survived something.
the
He'll be like,
staircase
oh
is
yeah, you remember
solid."
that backpacking trip that we just went out in the middle of nowhere for 7 days? Well, the water pump wasn't working and that's why I had to be the one to go do it.
That only happened once.
So what's under the staircase?
The staircase is fine. I was trying to use it as an example
Right.
that, you know, like sometimes you want to redo something just because you want it right, but it's more like a compulsive inclination and it doesn't need to be redone.
Compulsive, you and me? No way.
I think you knitters want everything to be right when it doesn't need to be.
Well, but sometimes you just let things go, or you find a patch or a way. Like that's what I did with this sweater, and I'll talk about it in the next segment. But like I tried to find a patch for it so that I wouldn't have to
That's
rip
true.
it out and
That's
redo
true.
it. And sometimes that's the way to go if you can be a little bit sneaky about it. But
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to start over, and you just learn a lot from that process.
And I think there's a kind of like a mindset you just need to adopt sometimes when you're doing a project, which is knowing that the first time through isn't going to be the last.
Yeah.
Um,
And that it's okay, like that you can actually
yeah.
you can learn more from it than.
I'm thinking about my steam bender right now.
Oh.
I mean, the first time I did it, I was building this steam tube for this wood I want to bend.
And I saw him just by the window near the trash can, so I was like, afterwards I asked him, I was
It
like,
was
were you
so
setting
screwed
fires
up.
in the trash can and boiling water
I was
that way?
pouring
so
water
confused.
all over the electric cords. It was melting the tubes, everything. But in the end, I know this afternoon when I do it, I think today, maybe
think?
tomorrow, whatever, it's going to be great. It's going to be great once I finally get it redone and dialed in.
Dialed in, yeah. So how do you think you learn best? Do you think you learn best just from doing and redoing? Or do you think you learn best from like reading or...
I think it's kind of a mix for me, like, like reading or watching some videos and like learning the basics.
Yeah.
And then the habit of like actually having done it a bunch of times, then I feel like I've got it. I truly know something, like know how to do something.
Yeah. I find that when it's messed up, I can see, if I can figure out why it's messed up, that actually teaches me more than...
You get excited when that happens.
Oh man, I'm like, oh look, I need to do this because with the sweater I did the decreases too frequently, like every row instead of every other row on the side that was messed up, so I ended up with a much steeper curve, and it just wasn't...
You just didn't...
It wasn't the right line. It was funny because on the model, when it was sitting in the 3 dimensions, it looked like it would be the right line, but when I laid it down, I could tell that it wasn't the right line because there was this gap about this big between what I had done and what the...
Then you had kind of like
shell
an
of the sweater
aha
was.
moment.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay, so I need to just rip this out and do a completely different rate of decrease. And it just like... Now I understand rates of decrease a lot better than I did just learning it out of a book or seeing it in a bunch of patterns. And like from a pattern you can execute
Rates
it.
of decrease.
Well, from a pattern you can execute it because
Yeah.
like someone just gives it to
Yeah.
you.
This was off book though.
This was off book, and it
Yeah.
was just kind of like cool to like, oh god, it clicked for me. Like I
Yeah.
finally get it now.
I'm warping the loom. The loom's right behind us. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm not really doing it. Debbie totally helped me do it, and now I'm just kind of... She left me with the task of finishing it, and I still don't really know what I'm doing. Like it just keeps getting bunched up, and I don't really know what I'm doing wrong or what's screwed up
And
about it.
sometimes you look at me and ask, and I'm just like, I don't know anything about weaving.
So I think I haven't actually learned how to warp a loom.
No,
I mean, I've done it
yeah.
twice now. This time is kind of it's going like it's getting warped, but I don't really know why the knots are forming.
But I
and
feel like
stuff.
the same with the warping a loom. Like you need to see it done, and then you need to do it yourself a couple different times, and then you need to like just try it yourself once and totally mess it up, and
then work in a sweatshop
Right.
on a loom job for years, for decades of your life.
continually warping and
Yeah,
warping and
and
rewarping.
then you know what's going on with looms.
Yeah. So, failure.
it?
Failure's good. You learn from it. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it?
Not really.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
It's lovely to have you on here.
Aw.
And your loom is looking almost
It's looking
dressed.
pretty good.
Almost dressed.
Dressed, is that the
You
term?
dressed the loom.
Almost dressed. It's
It's a little undressed right
in
now.
a state of undress.
State of undress.
And duress.
Yeah. And the dogs even managed to keep occupied, so that's good. All right.
See ya. Check
Thank
me on
you,
YouTube, Meta Spencer.
Oh boy. See ya. So I hope you enjoyed that segment, and now let's talk about the sweater that inspired it all. This is Carol Feller's Dark Pearl, and you guys may remember this sweater from a few episodes ago. I was talking to you about modifying it, and that was partially because the original version of this sweater has a kind of scalloped, lacy front that you would normally knit from this side of the sweater over horizontally, and you'd kind of be adding increases at the top to create that kind of ruched effect that you see in her sample here. Beautiful sweater, and that is, you know, the reason I picked up the pattern is because I like Carol Feller's patterns. I love the design work that she does, and I found this one in Germany when I was at a yarn shop there that I really loved, and I really wanted to just get a pattern and some yarn to remember that trip by, and that's how I came home with the Dark Pearl pattern. And the trouble was that once I got the shell knit, I really loved the shell, and the shell is asymmetrical, as you might remember. It's knit just to this point under the arm, down this side, and then over here it's knit, this front panel is part of the shell, so it's very asymmetrical. And I just loved the shell, and I really wanted to be able to wear it, and I knew from looking at project pages that I probably wouldn't be able to wear this version of it because of the way that it kind of sits on most people's bodies on their project pages. Just didn't look comfortable. People talked about tugging at it, they talked about frogging it, they talked about letting it sit in their closet. It just wasn't the kind of project page note that you really wanted to read and inspired you to actually wear a sweater. So what I decided to do is modify the sweater with a new front. Now that meant potentially turning this asymmetrical sweater into a symmetrical sweater, which is what my plan was. And you can see here, this was my original sketch of the sweater, and I was kind of hopeful that it would create this kind of cable-y front with a couple of lines running up and down it, and that is what I ended up with. I have these garter stitch ridges here and here. This is the one that I added to the front of the pattern to match this guy over here, and I chose this elfin lace pattern as my pattern, and I can share it with you because it's an open source pattern from let's see, do I have the nerdyknitters.com. So this is their elfin lace chart, which I really, really love the way that the lace turns out. I think it's really beautiful. So figuring out how to integrate the lace panel, how to get it to be centered on the front of the sweater, all of these different kinds of decisions were things that I had to figure out. And I wanted to, because it was going to be symmetrical, and because I'm dealing with a raglan, I wanted this, what was already in existence in the sweater, this part, to appear again over here, which meant I needed to figure out some measurements. I needed to do some ribbing. I needed to make sure that my ribbing wouldn't pull everything too tight. And so then I needed to integrate some decreases from the many stitches that I put on for the ribbing down to the fewer stitches so that the body would kind of come in and shape nicely on the side. And that's partially because this sweater has all of its shaping in the back. It has these darts in the back here that are pretty awesome. You can see them here and here, here and here. And so all the shaping for this sweater is done in the back. So when I went to create this side, I had to do some shaping and I had to disguise it. So I put it right alongside this garter tab. Just a few decrease rows, but it had to happen. Other considerations were the raglan sleeves. So trying to figure out the rate of decrease. And you should be able to tell because, you know, the pattern tells you what the rate of decrease is over here. And I knew what the rate of decrease was for this front part of the shell. But that's where the failure comes in. So I'm going to insert a photo here so that you can see how I managed to mess up the front. And it was funny because I put in purposefully, I'm doing this lace panel, I put in these lifelines. And lifelines, for those of you who don't know, if you're doing lace work, it's often, if you have to frog something or rip something out, it's so much easier if you have lifelines in, because lace work has a lot of yarn overs and other weird little stitches that if you were to just kind of try to go across and pick up your stitches and then rip something out like you would in stockinette, you'll often miss some of the key points and you might have to tink back further than you want to. So I had a lifeline in here right when I started this upper portion of the sweater where it was more complicated, and then I had another lifeline in here where I knew I was going to start binding off for the neckline, and I wanted to make sure I could go back if I needed to. So I knit up the whole sweater all the way up past this lifeline, the whole neck was done, everything was pretty. I seamed it up, you know, I seamed it over here, I seamed up the raglan, I seamed this up here in such a way that I was actually joining stockinette and garter stitch, and it looked great, and I preserved these stitches, and I was like really psyched. And I took it in to show Spencer. I kind of put it on. I was like, oh, all that's left is to just grab some stitches and do a collar. And he was like, that's awesome, it looks great, but is that shoulder meant to kind of like, what's going on there? And I'll put in some pictures here so that you can see what he saw. And I thought, oh no, my rate of decrease is totally wrong. And it was partially because I had, at first when I planned the sweater, I laid out the shell that I had flat, and I kind of did the measurements from that. And then as I was knitting this, I had the shell kind of hanging on the mannequin, and I was holding the front panel up to it, and it looked good, but it wasn't right because this part of the shell was actually sitting too far forward, which made me think that my rate of decreases needed to be much steeper than it did. So in the pictures, you'll be able to see that if the first shot of this front panel, this decrease here actually came in like way over here and just basically cut off a huge chunk of the sweater so that I was joining this to down here almost. It really was funny looking. And I tried a patch. I tried to be ingenious about this and not try to frog the whole thing and just put a patch in there. But even with my pretty good mattress stitching skills, I couldn't graft the patch in well enough. So I frogged the whole upper part of this sweater all the way from here down to the bust. And of course, by that time, since I had thought I had finished the sweater, I had no lifelines anywhere. And I had to kind of figure out where I was in the lace pattern. Luckily, and this is something I totally recommend if you're doing modifications and design your own, I kept good notes for myself on the side of my lace chart that told me when I bound off what I thought I needed to bind off for this underarm portion. So I knew I was on a certain row in the pattern at that point. So once I got to those bound off stitches, I could kind of refigure out where I was in the lace chart and just start moving back up. But boy, oh boy, the frogging process is never fun, especially when you have a finished sweater, what you think is a finished sweater, and you're just like, well, that's it, it's gotta go. But I do think it's the best way to go, and I learned a lot with this sweater because I had to, just like with the remake along that we did last year, I had to look at a kind of finished shell, and I had to look at my own design in my mind about what it was supposed to look like, and I had to make the two match with just the skills that I had and not a pattern to help me at all. And I do think that process teaches you so much about knitting and about how decreases work and how to stitch things up and how to improvise and where to improvise. So for example, with this raglan, I wanted to, even though it's not a true raglan, it's like a set-in sleeve raglan, I wanted it to mimic the raglan over here, which has a knit two together and a slip-slip knit on either side. And I wanted to make sure that when I seamed it up, I would preserve that seam. So you want to seam it, and usually with seaming, you want it to be invisible. Like this over here, this is a seam, but it's completely invisible. But with this seam, I wanted to preserve the kind of raglan look to the whole thing. And with this seam over here, between this garter tab and my stockinette, I wanted to preserve all the stitches in this garter tab because I had 3 stitches here and 3 stitches here, and I wanted them to match. So I ended up grafting my stockinette to my garter stitch in a kind of funky way, and I have a little mini video about that I'm gonna upload as a separate file so that you guys can see that process. Then there's the neckline. So I went online looking for basic formulas for necklines, and I found Amy Herzog's. She has a great blog post up about some of the basic formulas, which I think are super helpful to know. And I'd much rather know a formula than have someone compute something for me. Because once you know the formula, then you can create this kind of neckline anywhere you want, anytime. And her formula is basically you bind off however many center stitches that you want. If you want to get a kind of crew or rounded neckline, you bind off a certain number of center stitches. And for me, that was about 8 stitches. And then for the next, I think she says 40%, I basically split the next 40 or 50% of the rest of the stitches. You take off every single row, so that's this rate of decrease here. And then on the last bit, you go every other row to decrease down to however many you want to decrease down to. So that formula will get you this kind of rounded neckline. And that was awesome to learn too. So the last little tidbit I want to say about this sweater is that because the yarn is a mixture of long wool and alpaca, this is the Titus by Bahram U, in case you need to be reminded. And this is 70% British wool, which is 50% Wensleydale and 20% Blueface Leicester and 30% alpaca. So it has an incredible drape to it, which is why it's really lovely. And the reason that I think Carol designed it with that lace front is because it's very drapey, very beautiful, very light and airy. And it has an incredible luster from the long wool. But the thing about alpaca is that even if it's in a 30% blend, it has the tendency to kind of like drape and be very relaxed. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I was adding this front panel is to be sure to add some structure to it. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. So seaming is one very good way to add structure. So this has a seam right here that's invisible unless you turn it over, and you can see it here. It has a seam over here where I join the other side of the front panel. And the way that I chose to do the neckline is with a simple pickup, knit one row, and then bind off with a kind of semi-stretchy bind off. And that creates something for the whole sweater to hang on. It's a little bit of a tighter neckline. I mean, it doesn't have as much elasticity as some necklines. Like if I put a ribbed neckline or something like that up there, it would behave very differently. But with this neckline, I know that it has something more structural to hang from, so it'll be less likely to kind of like goo out in one way or another with the neckline. So yeah, and I do think it came out really beautifully, and I'm super excited about it. It was an adventurous knit. It took me a long time. I'm really glad that I paused between the shell knitting and the front panel knitting to really think about it, to think about what I'd wear, what would be fun and useful, what would make this a real learning project. And all of those things came true, and I'm super satisfied with this. It was really a sweater of a lot of learning, a lot of failure, a lot of frogging. I am super happy with it now. And I think it came out well, and I'm really kind of excited to have taken an asymmetrical sweater and turned it into a symmetrical sweater that I know I will actually wear. So I'll insert a few photos here. Hopefully by then, by the time I put this up, I'll have had a chance to take this outside and get it photographed. And yeah, so that is dark pearl. It's no longer really dark pearl. It's like my own pearl. I was calling it the red pearl on Ravelry, so that's what I think I'll call it, the red pearl. Great learning experience, really fun, and I highly recommend this kind of stuff to anyone who's feeling adventurous. So let me tell you about the next sweater. The next sweater is going to teach me some other construction methods, and by that I mean some sideways knitting. So this is Rumo by Alice Catano, and I'll show you this. It's not as easy to see in black and white because of the yarn that she's using. I can show you these photos as well. So there is the back of the sweater. I'll try to get it to focus here for you. There you go, that's the back of the sweater. So then pretty good photos there. It's got a funky asymmetrical kind of lapel thing going on. Well, I guess it's symmetrical, it's just unusual, which I like. And Alice Catano is actually, when I was looking up some of her other patterns on Ravelry, I realized that she had this other beautiful pattern that I found and loved. Now this is from Amishu, which is a Japanese knitting magazine, which is a beautiful Japanese knitting magazine. And she has a sweater in here called Inkwell, which you may have seen making the rounds on Ravelry, and it is a really, really beautiful sweater. So she does some cool things with like black and white and texture. There's some other photos of it. So that's Inkwell, and I'm gonna knit her side-to-side sweater, Rumo. And I'm going to do it in the color that she has, because I looked at a bunch of project pages, and I think this particular pattern, it kind of needs the striping to help you see the variegation in the yarn and the striping to kind of help you see the construction. So I'm going to use the yarn that she recommended, and this is partially because I looked at a bunch of project pages, and I feel like the yarn that she's using has enough natural variation in tone between the natural colors to show you how the sweater is knit, which is to say that in the back it's knit this way to the center, and then, you know, the sleeves are knit in the other direction, a more normal direction, but from the bottom up. So I'm going to be using this yarn, which is the Beroa, and it is quite a beautiful natural color. This yarn is from Portugal. It is, let's see, it's manufactured in Portugal from the lustrous wool of Bordalera Sierra de Estrella sheep. So cool, new to me yarn. And it's just, I love their tag, by the way. They've got a great little, they've got the hole for the tag is like looped right through the O. I dig that kind of design. So this is what it looks like caked up. And I think it's just a beautiful kind of natural color, and it'll go with everything. This will be something that I wear to work a lot. I like to wear jackets and things to work, especially if it's cold. So I think it'll be a perfect pattern. So I'll let you know how I get on with that. That is the next sweater on the needles. Okay, so we're on to the book segment. You guys seem to have been enjoying these books segments from the podcast, so I'm here with another one for you. This is The Complete Book of Progressive Knitting by Ida Riley Duncan. And I found this on eBay. I think it was pretty cheap, maybe $5, something like that. I don't know how many copies are out there in the world. This was first published in 1940. I have a 1943 edition here. If you look on Ravelry under Ida Riley Duncan's name, you'll see other more psychedelic covers for this book. I think it was reissued in the 60s and 70s. And I kind of did a little digging and found out a little bit more about Ida Riley Duncan, because I thought you guys might enjoy knowing. So she is, and this is a book that's like, it says it's the complete book of progressive knitting. So, you know, it's about teaching you how to knit and teaching you some of the basics. But what she's really interested in is garment construction, which I got pretty excited about. So she was an instructor in adult homemaking classes at Wayne University in Detroit. And the foreword to this book has some great kind of quotes from the supervisor of home economics in Detroit Public Schools and the supervisor of adult homemaking in Detroit Public Schools. And they're pretty excited about what Ida Duncan is doing in this book. And I went on to look up a little bit more about her because I was really kind of curious. And I found her obituary, and I'll show you guys here. This is her obituary. Let's see if it'll work with the light. All right. So I'll read you a little bit from this. That's her. You can see her in the image there. And I love that the obituary is headed ex-professor, anti-feminist, wrote books about knitting. It's kind of like, I don't want to be an anti-feminist, but I kind of hope that like my obituary has like that much punch to it, you know, like ex-professor, feminist, wrote books about knitting. That would be a pretty good obituary as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so the obituary says, an English-born World War I bride who spent most of her adult life in Detroit, Wayne State University Professor Emeritus Ida Riley Duncan Higginson gained national fame for her views on knitting and feminism. The author of 5 books on needlecraft also headed the state chapter of a national anti-feminist organization, Right About Face, in the late 60s and early 70s. Her hands were never still, her daughter, Margaret Basson of Northville said, recalling her mother's ability to knit. She knit beautiful suits and formal wear for women. Mrs. Higginson's home economics instructor at Wayne State from 1936 to 1960. She died on Saturday of congestive heart failure. Her books, published under the name Ida Duncan, were circulated worldwide and include Knit to Fit and Needles and Pins, which are used as textbooks in schools throughout the country. She developed formulas for knitting so that home knit clothing would fit properly. You just take the measurements and you're on your way, Baston said. Her students adored her, Baston said. She was a smart aleck sometimes, but unbelievably bright and witty. And in 1970, Mrs. Higginson attempted to debate Betty Friedan, founder of the National Organization for Women, on Lou Gordon's popular talk show, Channel 50. Friedan declined. I love that. So I think that obituary is pretty punchy, and I do appreciate someone with these characteristics that Ida Duncan had, even if she was an anti-feminist. I'm, you know, to each his or her own. So let me tell you a little bit about this book, which is pretty amazing. And to me, it's actually one of the first garment books that actually works the way I think, which I found incredibly helpful. So she has a brief history of knitting and a brief kind of history and about wool section. So and most of these books begin with that, like, where is knitting from and what is wool? How do we use it? And she has a basic chapter on the fundamentals of knitting, purl stitches, all that kind of stuff. But then, I mean, this is the book of progressive knitting. She doesn't go to any small project. She goes right into garments. So she has a chapter on garments with all kinds of formulas, a chapter on raglans with yarn overs for increases, raglans with set-in sleeves, details, and then she has a chapter on skirts, knitted pants for small boys. I love how this is progressive. Like, we go from garments to skirts to knitted pants for small boys, blouses made from different combinations of stitches, mittens and gloves, socks and stockings, hats, baby clothes. Now, a lot of us would start in the opposite order with like baby clothes and hats, mittens and socks, and then work our way up to garments. But she's like, nope, jump right into garments. And then the last chapter is one of my favorite. It's what vocations are available in the knitting field. And she talks about being a salesperson and a writer and creating garments, or being a professional knitter, working for a newspaper or a magazine. So it's a pretty interesting book. But let me show you these formulas, and let me explain why this all makes sense to me. So when I first started looking at this book, I noticed that she had everything's hand-drawn. She has these incredible hand-drawn diagrams throughout. So that's a sleeve and a sleeve cap. Let me go to the beginning of the garment section. And she has all of her garments kind of drawn out like this with handwritten notes on them. And this is how I do my patterns. So here she has the rate of decrease for some armholes for this sweater body, and each little X represents a knit two together, means knit two together every other row. So she has the X's marking the spot and her little key. And then later on, when she gets into all of the more complex sweater stuff, and she's talking about how to decrease, she has what I do, which is to write down the number of stitches that will be left after, you know, you're doing your rate of decrease. So it just makes sense to me. It's like I finally have a book that has formulas in it. It's not a pattern book. It's not meant to just like give you the pattern. You know, what's that saying, right? Like, teach a man to fish and he can feed himself for a long time. If you give me some formulas, I will seriously learn a lot. So again, here's some more of those little tips and tricks. And I adore this book, and I think I'm going to read it cover to cover and learn so much, especially with some great, this guy's great. Gotta love that guy. Yeah? It's really, and by the time she gets back to the mittens and gloves and things, she has everything diagrammed for, I mean, this is way before Magic Loop, so she has everything diagrammed for double pointed needles. So that's how your stitches would appear on your double DPNs. And this is in the mittens and gloves section. And just tons of formulas. I love how she represents her little stitches as little balls, little circles. So I feel like I can actually learn a lot from this book. And I've been looking for a book that really got into the formulas of things. And so that is what this book does. Now, she also has a great couple of notes on, let me show you this. In the beginning, when she's talking about yarn choice, she has a couple of recommendations that I think we all need to remember. Number 8, bathing suit yarn. Okay, for all of us who are planning on making bathing suits. All good bathing suit yarn should be guaranteed fast color. That is, it should be immune to both sun and salt water when correctly dried. Bathing suits should always be knitted very tight on small needles, or else they will stretch when in the water. And I just, you know, like I have seen very few notes about bathing suit yarns, and I think it's an important factor here, an important thing to think about for us. yeah, so bathing suit yarns. Ida Riley Duncan, Complete Book of Progressive Knitting. She also has a book called Knit to Fit, which I have ordered from some little seller somewhere for about $10. I'm looking forward to checking that one out and seeing what else she has to learn. I believe that one is kind of like the home course for what she used to teach at the university. So I'll hopefully have that one on here for you to check out in a future podcast. So 2 final things for the podcast today. Number 1, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who volunteered to test knit the hat for the new yarn that's coming out next week. I had 5 test knitters work on the pattern, and the pattern is just about to be finalized now. The yarn will be released next weekend, so look out for that video. And I want to say thank you to everyone who volunteered, and I'm really hopeful that I'll have some kind of pattern to test knit in the future that we can collaborate on. So thank you so much for volunteering your time. And the last thing is that remember, this 2019 is our year of modifications on the podcast. So this is the year that if you have a pattern you want to change, you want to jump in and get in on this modification stuff and try something new, even if it's minor, this is your year. So we've got threads over on Ravelry in the group. 1 thread for garment knitting and 1 for accessories. So things like shawls, hats, mittens, socks, any of that kind of stuff. And you can jump in on either thread, both threads. And this is meant to be a fun knit-along year for beginners and experts alike. So if you've never modified a pattern, or if this is the 50, 100,000 Google-ish pattern that you've modified, jump in on it. It'll be fun to hear from everybody and see what you guys are up to and learn from each other. So that's our year of modifications, and I'll put a link in the show notes for that. It has been lovely to hang out with you guys today. I hope you have a great bit of knitting ahead of you until I see you again. And remember that next weekend is going to be the yarn launch. I'll put up a separate video for it, and I'll let you know that the yarn is available, and we're going to do kits, and we're going to have patterns, and it's all kinds of fun stuff. So I'll see you in a week. Take care.